All right, in this video, we're going to learn a little bit about R Markdown. First, let's talk about why we need R Markdown, or why we should care about this tool that we can access from RStudio. Thus far, we've been playing around in the console, so typing things like code, like 2 plus 3, and getting output such as 5. Now, the console is really good for playing around and making mistakes and learning about our mistakes, but it's bad for other things. So mainly the console is bad for preserving, updating, or reproducing our work. So imagine that we wanted to include this code or something maybe more sophisticated in a homework document. In order to do that, we would have to do tedious things like copy and paste the code and the output from this document, put it into a Word or similar document, format it, etc. So not only is this tedious, it makes it difficult to update our work. So if I wanted to come back and instead add 2 and 4 instead of 2 and 3, I'd have to redo that entire process. Also, in this kind of copy and paste approach to working between RStudio and a document like Word, it's often the case that I miss something. That is, I have some detail in my analysis that I forget to copy and paste, and with that missing link, I'm not able to go back and reproduce what I did. So basically, we want to preserve our work, be able to update it, and be able to reproduce it. So this is where R Markdown will come in. It's great at everything that the console is bad at. So it's great for communicating, organizing, preserving, and revising our work. And the basic idea that you'll see today is that an R Markdown document, I have kind of a separate raw document, and from that document, I get an HTML or a PDF document that includes really anything. So I can type text in it. I have R code, so that is what I type into R, such as 2 plus 3. I get the R output, so the results of my code, such as 5, and so much more. So like any other word processor, I can put in things like images, links. If you're somebody who writes mathematical equations, you can do mathematical typesetting, basically like LaTeX, if you're familiar with LaTeX. And if you're not, no problem. All right, so for the remainder of the video, I'm going to go over and do a demo in McAllister's RStudio server. There is a set of slides that marks kind of the steps of everything I'm doing. So I encourage you to kind of just follow along for now, notice the big ideas, and then after the video, perhaps come back to the slides and step by step reproduce what I've done in the video here. So over in RStudio, I want to start by creating a new R Markdown document. To do so, I can go to File, New File, and there are a bunch of options, but the one that I want is an R Markdown file. Now, when I get this pop-up, to save myself 5 seconds, I personally just click OK. So these are kind of just some default options for my document, but I'm just going to click OK. Now notice what happens. When I click OK, then I get this new document. Now it looks maybe intriguing, all of this stuff that pops up in this new document that I just started, and perhaps overwhelming. So another thing that I do is I just get rid of it all at once. So I want to start fresh. So at this point, I've started an R Markdown document. I've deleted kind of all of the default information that was populated into that document. So now I can use this like a word processor. So I'm going to start by adding a title. I'll call this document a demo. Now notice it's in red because I haven't saved my document. So we should get in the habit of saving often, especially right at the beginning. This file doesn't even have a name yet. So I can either go to File, Save As, like with most word processors, or here I'll just click on this, save this old disk. Right, so in my case, I'll go to my Stat Math 155 folder. So this is when you want to start at the very beginning of a course, being really organized with your file structure. Make sure that you're saving your files in a place where you know they exist. So you don't want to put a file or save a file in your downloads. You want to have a folder that's specifically for organizing your work in this course. And so suppose the course I'm taking is Math 155. I'm going to call this my demo document, and then I'm going to save. So now notice over here on the right in my files, at least if you're working on the server, I see this demo document. It has the extension RMD, which is an R Markdown document. So RMD is an R Markdown document. Okay, so far I have a very boring document and I've saved it. Now we're going to see kind of where the R Markdown pizzazz comes in. So to do so, I'm going to click this knit button that looks like a yarn ball with a knitting needle coming out of it. And when I drop down, notice that I can create an HTML document, a PDF document, a Word document. But just by default, we're going to knit to an HTML, which basically just means turn this R Markdown document into an HTML document. Now when I do, for me, something pops up in my viewer pane. We'll see how to change this setting at the end of the video today. When you knit your document, it might pop up as like a pop-up window, so outside of your RStudio. We'll change that later. Right, so one thing to notice is that now I have two files. I have my R Markdown document over here that I can edit and type in. And then I have this corresponding knit HTML version. But this is static. I cannot change this. As much as I try to type over here, nothing changes. So I can't edit this document. This document is basically the compiled version of this raw document over here, my R Markdown. All right, so now I can do things like I would do in any word processor. So I can start typing sentences. Again, a good practice is to knit often, just to make sure that what we see on the left is, or what we expect to see from what we typed on the left is actually what we see. And it is. Now I want to start distinguishing between things like text and titles. So just as you can in a word processor, you can add section titles or document titles. Here in this Markdown language, you can do that using a pound sign. So if I put a pound sign in front of a word and I knit my document, notice that it's increased the font size. So pound signs I use for things like section headers or subsection headers. If I wanted a subsection header, I could do something smaller. Right. Okay, so I can write regular text, like this is my first doc. I can write section and subsection headers using the pound sign. I can also do things like other word processors, such as bolding and italicizing text. So for example, please let me share how excited I am about our Markdown. Suppose I want to italicize please. The way that I do that in Markdown is I put asterisks on either side. So I start and I end with an asterisk. So notice when I knit my document, I'll see my sentence. By putting asterisks around please, it italicizes it. If I want to really emphasize how excited I am, I don't only want to italicize, but say I want to bold it, I just put two asterisks in front and at the end of the word. And when I knit it, I see a bold word. Right, so thus far, what we've seen is basically like any word processor except a different markdown. It's called a markdown approach. So I'm kind of coding in where do I want a section header, what's just plain old text, so I didn't do anything special here. Where do I want an italicized word or a bold word? Right, so basic word processor stuff except a different approach. Now where R Markdown really comes into play in data analysis, or in particular this course, is that it can also do something that you can't do in a Word document or say a Google document, and that is that I can add R code directly into my document. Now to do so, notice that if I just type say 2 plus 3, say I want to run that code, and I knit my document, it shows up as just text when I do so. So if I want to run R code from my R Markdown document, I have to communicate inside my R Markdown document. So a way to communicate the distinction between whether something is text or something is code. So one kind of straightforward way to do this as you're getting started is going to the Insert button here. And I want to insert R code. So that's kind of the default here. So if I click Insert and then R, I get this kind of grayed out box. And we call this an R chunk. So that's the technical term for this. I didn't make it up. It's not a little pet nickname. It's an R chunk. So everything that I type inside this chunk will be recognized as R code instead of text. So now if I type 2 plus 3 inside this R chunk, nothing happens automatically. If I click this green arrow button inside my Markdown document, this is a good way to kind of preview what will happen when I knit my document or compile my document. So I often you'll have your own workflow, but when I'm working in a Markdown document, I often use this green button as a kind of a progress check. And then when we knit our document, so compile it to our final version, notice what happens over here on the right. So I don't see kind of this background code that defined this as an R chunk, but I do see both what I typed for the code, so 2 plus 3, and I see the output of 5. Right, so again, this is a way, our Markdown documents give us a way to document our work inside R. And another note about the chunk, I can also write these from scratch. I don't have to use insert, so if I use these kind of 3 tick marks, so this is what indicates we're starting an R chunk. So 3 tick marks, curly brackets, and inside the curly brackets, this lowercase letter r to say this is an R chunk. And then when I'm done writing code, I use 3 lines. So perhaps I have a second line of code here. Whoops, don't want caps. And so again, if I just kind of check my progress, I see 2 numbers here. It's not very helpful. Maybe if I do square root of 16, it'll be more distinguishable. So 2 plus 3 is 5, square root of 16 is 4. And then when I knit that, I'll see both. So subsequently, so 2 plus 3 is 5, the square root of 16 is 4. Okay, so this is nice. This means that when I want to update my work, so I can come back and say add 2 plus 4 or the square root of 25, whatever the case may be. The code is there, so I know what I typed and I know the corresponding output. All right, so what's next? These are the basics. So what's next is the getting fancy part. So the basics of R Markdown is it allows us to use kind of it's kind of like the same tools as a regular word processor. So I can have titles, subsections, and so on. I can have regular text. I can have italicized text and bold text. And the main feature that we're excited about is that we can include R code and it shows the output directly in our document. So now we're going to talk about the things that are kind of going above and beyond and getting a little bit fancier. So we can add things like images. So if I want to add an image, again, don't worry about memorizing what I'm doing here. Just notice what we can do. And then it's easy, not easy. Well, it will be more and more straightforward for you to look up and remind yourself, how do I create an image? But to create an image, have goofy looking code, so an exclamation mark, open and close square parentheses or square brackets, and open and close parentheses. And then inside the parentheses, I can give an address for an image. So that can either be an address to a file on my machine or an internet address. So in my case, I already picked one out on the internet, so I'm just going to copy and paste it here. Well, I'm not actually going to copy and paste it, but I'm going to show you what happens. So if I include an image, this was an address that I found online, a picture of McAllister. So again, if I have this raw R Markdown code on the left, it just looks like a URL, not very exciting. And then when I knit my document, it knows to put that image here. Another thing that I'll just show you instead of demoing in these slides here is that, again, for those of you who do use mathematical typesetting like LaTeX in your work, you can do that directly from within R Markdown. So for example, I can use LaTeX type notation to write out the square root of 25 in mathematical notation. And when I knit my document, notice that shows up as a square root. Another thing is in making errors, you'll make a lot of errors. And in making errors, it's important to know that R Markdown does not communicate with the console. So I'll show you just a quick example of an error, and I'll come back to the idea in a minute. But the idea here of this most common error in R Markdown is that I've done something in the console. So for example, I can do things like assign an object a number. So I can say I'm going to assign the number 4 to x. Or that is, I'm going to say that x equals 4. So when I type x down here in the console where I've defined x, it knows what I'm talking about. It says, well, you just defined x as 4, so when I type x, I'll give you back 4. Now if I go up to my R Markdown document and I have an R chunk and I write x, if I just run it, it will make me think that I've defined x as 4. But notice when I knit my document, I get an error. So it says that object x is not found. So even though when I run it from within the Markdown document, it recognizes what I'm talking about, when I knit it, it doesn't. Also notice that in my error message, it tells me what line my error was in. It says line 19. So I can either go up to line 19 to recognize where my error is, or I can double click this and it'll send me up to line 19. So I'll come back to that error in a minute. I just wanted to show it to you for now. Whoops. All right, so related to making that particular error, there are other hot tips. So always keep your files organized. Again, don't save your files inside your downloads, for example. Make sure that you have a course-related folder on your machine and that you keep your files organized in that folder. Another hot tip is to knit often. So clicking that knit button to see what we get when we compile our document. This is really important. Our documents are going to get long. And if you don't knit often, what's going to happen is that at some point in your document, you'll have an error. And that's really frustrating to come back and find the error and fix the error at kind of the end of your process in the middle of a long document. You're going to save yourself a lot of stress if you just knit very frequently so that when an error occurs, you can get in front of it instead of it popping up at the very end of your process. And that's very frustrating. And finally, related to this error that I just showed you, right now it probably doesn't make much sense because we aren't doing that much with our R code. So thus far, we're just adding numbers and calculating square roots and things like that. But just an advance warning, this is the error that will happen the most. So again, as I said, your R Markdown document does not communicate with the console. When I say that, what I mean is that your R Markdown document doesn't know what objects you've defined in your console. If you've loaded packages such as ggplot2 in your console, your R Markdown document doesn't know that. It only knows and it can only use what you've typed into the R Markdown. So if you need something in your R Markdown, so a specific object or package, it must be typed into that Markdown document. So you can't rely on work that you've done outside that document. Relatedly, the order of lines in a Markdown document is important. So a given line only knows what has happened in the lines above it, not the lines below it. So for example, if I load the ggplot2 package at the bottom of my document, it can't be used until that point. And finally, if you get an error message, and you will, when you try to knit, it'll say that something is not found. This is the most common error message that you'll see. So in this example that I showed you, it said, object X not found. That is R Markdown communicating with you that you thought that you might have defined X in your R Markdown document, but you did not. So at that point, when it says object X not found, that is user error. That is not an R Markdown error. That means that you need to be more careful about what you think you've typed into your R Markdown document. And finally, two things. So these are optional. So if you're using Mac's RStudio server, and some of you will be, it's important to frequently export your files to your own machine. So when I created this document earlier, my demo document on the server, right now it's only living on the server. Now, one issue with that is that the server is sometimes scrubbed, so files are deleted without kind of advanced warning. This is just how the server works. So to stem off the chance that your files get lost in that process, it's important that you don't rely on RStudio server to save your work. So you should frequently be exporting your files from the server into your own machine. So to do that, I go to the Files tab. I find the files that I want to save and preserve. So here I want to save the demo R Markdown document. So that's my raw work. It's important to save that. So if I want to change something, I can. I also want to save the HTML. So what was the nice kind of better looking version when I compiled that R Markdown. So I click the files that I want to save on my own machine. I click on this More gear button and export. So export means I'm exporting from the server onto my own machine. And once you click export, then you'll have to decide where on your machine you want to save that work. And again, it's important that you save it in a course-related folder. The final thing that I'll share, and this is just optional, if you want your HTML, so when you knit your document, I don't want to do that again because that was an error, but when you knit your document, if you want it to show up in your viewer, like this, as opposed to a pop-up window, you can do that by changing your global options. Now, this is going to be a little bit different whether you're using the server or your own version of R on your own machine, but the idea is the same. So you'll need to find somewhere in these drop-down menus. It'll be in a different place depending on, again, what RStudio you're using. For the server, it's under Tools. So under Tools, I find Global Options. So Global Options is what I'm looking for. Global Options just means basically I can control what RStudio looks like. When I click on Global Options, there are a bunch of things that I can change. So I can change the appearance of things, so I can change how my code looks. Right now I have it at TextMate, but I can change that. I'm just going to leave it as the default. But if you want to change where your HTML compiled document appears, you can go to the R Markdown option here. And then notice here, it says Show Output Preview In. And then I can select where I want my output preview or my HTML document to appear. By default, it might be in window, meaning kind of a pop-up window that you have to navigate to. Here I'm saying I want it to be in the viewer pane. So that viewer pane is what's down here on the lower right for me. And then I click Apply and OK. So that's just kind of getting into the extra bells and whistles, but you'll find that your own R Markdown workflow is important to your workflow and your use of R. So the more comfortable that you get with kind of just navigating your work within RStudio, the easier your workflow will be. So if having that kind of extra little bell and whistle helps you in your workflow, then it's definitely worth it.